Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a visceral breakdown of a day that forever altered American history. We're going to shift our perspective away from the grand, overarching political stakes of the Civil War and bring things right down into the absolute grit and dirt of the battlefield itself. We're talking about how seemingly everyday geography clashed with advancing military tech to create just an absolute perfect storm of devastation. Let's get right into it.
So, to set the scene, it's September 17, 1862. The Battle of Antietam. Now, the early morning of this fateful day was already defined by what historical sources call shocking carnage in a nearby 30-acre cornfield. It was chaotic, it was bloody, and it was relentless, with lines of men literally being scythed down like the very crops they were standing in. But, as the morning wore on and the smoke thickened, the desperate focus of the battle took a dramatic shift southward, really zeroing in on the center line of the conflict.
The single bloodiest day in American history. Just let that sink in for a second. Before we zoom into the terrifying, micro-level tactical details, we really have to wrap our heads around the sheer scale of the stakes here. This wasn't just another engagement in a long war. No, this was a brutal, head-on collision that pushed human endurance and the sheer cost of conflict to absolutely unprecedented heights. The sheer amount of lead exchanged in these few hours fundamentally changed how the nation understood the dark reality of war.
All right, so let's look at the tactical setup. We're focusing really closely on the specific geography right at the center of the Confederate line. And in military strategy, terrain is quite literally destiny, right? A gentle slope, a line of trees, or in this specific case, a seemingly harmless farming path can offer a highly lethal opportunity to whoever controls it. The Southern troops dug in right here because they recognized immediately that the ground itself was about to become their absolute best weapon against the incoming Federal assault.
And they ruthlessly utilized this environment. See, over years of heavy wagon traffic hauling crops to market, combined with just relentless seasonal rain washing it out, this simple farm dirt road had actually sunk several feet below the surrounding fields. It was basically a ready-made trench, perfectly positioned. But they didn't stop there. They actually knocked down the heavy Virginia snake rail fences lining the road, dismantled them, and stacked that heavy timber to build these formidable, improvised defensive breastworks. Through sheer physical labor and serious tactical awareness, they managed to turn a rutted, everyday farm road into an almost impregnable fortress.
This setup brilliantly illustrates the brutal tactical puzzle of the day. On one side, you've got the Confederate advantage, that deeply protected natural trench, paired with those heavy timber breastworks, which allowed their men to load and fire while barely exposing themselves. On the other side, the Union advantage. They held the slightly higher ground approaching the road, and they possessed the sheer, overwhelming weight of superior numbers. So what happens when these two immensely powerful forces actually collide? Well, according to first-hand accounts, it wasn't some battle of subtle, elegant maneuvers. No, it became a pure, stand-up, knockdown, bloody fight. Both sides just stood their ground to brutally slug it out in a horrific war of attrition.
The crucial point here is how the Union eventually solved this deadly puzzle. Union commanders quickly realized they couldn't just keep feeding waves of men directly from the front into a heavily entrenched enemy. That was tactical suicide. So, they had to execute a flanking maneuver. Using their higher terrain and massive numerical advantage, they shifted their focus. Instead of charging that impregnable center head-on, they systematically began to envelop the sides, the far ends of the Confederate defensive line. They used their sheer numbers to stretch the defenders way past their breaking point. And by wrapping around those vulnerable edges, those enveloping Union forces created an absolute nightmare. That sunken road, which had been this perfect, nearly impenetrable shield against a frontal assault, rapidly turned into a suffocating death trap. Union troops started pouring an unbearable, relentless crossfire down into the trench from multiple devastating angles. There was literally nowhere left to hide. The pressure mounted at terrifying speed, finally breaking those stubborn lines and forcing the vanquished Confederates to retreat from the position they'd held so fiercely all morning long. But you see, the story doesn't just end with a simple tactical retreat. As Union forces pursued the fleeing rebels, they advanced down the slope and actually stepped into the captured sunken road itself. And what they found waiting for them there was a scene of absolute, unimaginable horror. The adrenaline of the assault immediately gave way to the grim, nauseating reality of what their crossfire had actually accomplished. The sheer volume of casualties concentrated in that narrow, claustrophobic dirt path earned the location a chilling new name. This was the birth of Bloody Lane.
The road was literally littered with hundreds of dead and wounded Confederate soldiers, piled upon one another in the trench. The bodies were so incredibly thick in that sunken earth that, according to the deeply traumatized soldiers who were actually standing there, a person could walk from one end of the lane to the other without ever stepping on the ground. They were simply treading on the fallen. It's a chilling, profoundly sobering image that completely redefines how we understand battlefield devastation and the true ugly face of combat.
Now, zooming back out to the macro level for a second, the tactical outcome of this horrific slaughter was highly consequential for the fate of the entire nation. By the end of the day, the immediate existential threat to the United States capital, Washington, D.C., was officially over. General Robert E. Lee's battered army simply could not sustain a forward push after absorbing such catastrophic losses. Ultimately, his forces were compelled to abandon the Maryland campaign entirely, retreating back across the Potomac River into Virginia.
But the cost, well, it was absolutely staggering. 8,000. That is the number of men who were killed or mortally wounded. 8,000 individual lives completely extinguished across this scarred terrain in just a single day of fighting. To put that into perspective, the magnitude of that kind of loss compressed into such a tiny window of time is almost too massive for the human brain to fully comprehend.
And right behind that devastating figure, an additional 15,000 men received severe wounds. When you combine those numbers together, you are looking directly at the unvarnished reality of modern industrial slaughter. I mean, this wasn't some minor skirmish out in a forgotten field. The sheer volume of rifled musket lead and artillery fire tearing through the air that day represented the mechanical, industrialized output of death on a truly massive, unprecedented scale.
Which brings us to the ultimate legacy of this specific stretch of battlefield. Today, Bloody Lane remains the most vivid, enduring symbol of this horrific attrition. It stands as a permanent, physical testament to exactly what happens when old-world, linear battle tactics, marching men in neat little rows, collide head-on with the devastating efficiency of advancing mid-19th century military technology. The tactics simply hadn't caught up to the weaponry yet, and the soldiers paid the ultimate price in blood.
So, it leaves us with a really profound question that anyone studying history eventually has to grapple with. As the dead filled the sunken road that September day, were the romantic ideals of war buried right alongside them? When you face the stark facts, the massive casualty numbers, and those visceral, devastating first-hand accounts from Bloody Lane, it becomes incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to ever view warfare through a lens of glory or grand adventure ever again. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this dive into the past has given you a powerful, maybe even challenging new perspective